In this case, I see a lot of advantages of student-centered teaching style compared to traditional teaching style. Mr. Taylor, instead of teaching students everything directly, lets students think through the question based on what they have already learned and give their personal thinking. He gives many guiding questions to help students go through the materials and find out the answers through their thinking. And he understands that students will have different thoughts, and he doesn't consider these thoughts as mistakes. He encourages all students to share their thoughts, which is always an improvement for their math thinking skill. Mr. Taylor's lectures tells us that rather than tell students everything, use guided materials to let students think through and find out the ideas is more beneficial for students' math learning, which could also train their skills of self-learning and thinking, which will be helpful for students learning in any subject area.
Overall, Ed has really tackled the challenge of teaching mathematics head on. He decided to take the math position in order to work with students in an engaging and meaningful way, and he's willingly taken advantage of opportunities presented to him to improve himself as an educator and to do what's best for his students. In the introduction alone, this case seems like a direct contrast to a previous case where the teacher was clearly uncomfortable with the material they were teaching and pushed back on professional development, which I believe highlights the importance of attitude in education. Throughout the lesson discussed in this case, you can also see how Ed's understanding of the material helps him in creating guided questions to encourage student thinking and discourse, but to also push them towards the answers they need to be getting. And you can see how the discussions the students are having during the lesson are helping them to gain an understanding of what is being taught.
I like Mr. Taylor's approach of breaking down the task into smaller, more manageable pieces. This strategy simplifies complex tasks and makes them more accessible to students. This method also allows teachers to identify where a student is struggling and plan for more targeted instruction and support. Mr. Taylor's method of introducing the S pattern was especially effective. He had the students begin by working on the task independently, then in small groups, and finally as a whole class. This layered approach allowed students to process the information gradually and prompted deeper understanding and critical thinking as they discussed and explained the task.
I think that Mr. Taylor's use of patterns to get his students thinking, reasoning, and making conjectures was a real benefit to his students. As the students included their thoughts about what they were seeing in the patterns, it made me think of ways to incorporate this type of observation in my lesson. I believe that the opportunity for students to hear what the other students thought of the pattern was to challenge their thinking and reasoning process.
We can say the students in Mr. Ed Taylor's class is going through an authentic process for learning. You can see where even when he had to stop and think about a student's answer, that student was able to explain their connection as well as go to the overhead projector to model their connection from the previous discussions. Um, I love how Mr. Taylor does not simply stop to make corrections, but guide students to seeing what their errors are and be able to go back and correct those misconceptions or errors.
So, a couple of quick reflections on the case study. The first is the lesson itself. I liked how concrete it was. Students could look in front of them and count the number of tiles and check their work. Gave them a lot of opportunities to come up with different answers and then use those answers and share them with their classmates who had equivalent but still correct answers, and they could discuss the similarities and the differences. So very impressed with this. Maybe a task I might want to use in the future if I'm introducing quadratics. The second big thing for me was just the students themselves. You can tell that they think mathematically. So in this case, it's a middle school class. Looks like they're trying to move into algebra, and they already have some of the the pattern recognition that you want whenever you move into algebra. So they've been doing it since the 6th grade. They're making formulas. And then one student in particular, Dwayne, had made a table. I was really impressed with this student. And he had inputs for the step numbers and the outputs for the tables. And he was able to calculate the second difference and then use that and make a sequence and write a quadratic formula before the teacher had even told him to do that. So, I mean, as a middle school level, that's quite impressive that he knew to look for that. So just, again, very impressed with the students and the lesson itself.
This case is a great example of how a task could be adjusted to encourage student learning, both the original and Mr. Taylor's version of the task as students complete the same question. However, while the original version asks students to look at the patterns simultaneously, Mr. Taylor looks at the square and S patterns separately. Mr. Taylor also breaks the task down into 5 steps. This allows students to look at the patterns before making a generalized formula. Having students recognize patterns can be beneficial to their learning when introducing and learning algebra, which could then be beneficial to them learning algebra in the future. Mr. Taylor also gave students enough time to look at the pattern individually and in small groups for sharing their observations with the class. Rather than teaching the class traditionally, he allows students to make connections on their own before bringing the class together. Mr. Taylor also asked follow-up questions to allow students to explain their reasonings without explicitly telling his students whether they're right or wrong. I think overall this is a great way to show that every lesson can be adjusted to fit your classroom needs and to make student learning a success.
Briefly, I noted that pressing students for justifications and explanations in our classroom pedagogy can be effective. Early experiences with patterns can lay the groundwork for exploring ideas like variables and functions. Patterns, formulas, and graphing. And what is their relationship? 5-minute interval for individual work, followed by 15 minutes of small group work, followed by whole class discussions for the remainder of the class. Creating data tables and graphing patterns. Also, moving away from small sets of physical tiles to incorporate larger sets of abstract values when graphing. And lastly, never assume that my students mean what I think they mean. Ask for clarification or deeper thinking. Ask students to show what they mean. Teaching clearly has infinite opportunities to impact students' lives and outcomes. Teaching also has just as many competing challenges to overcome when gaining students' attention or getting them engaged in our classes. The case of Ed Taylor gives us all a glimpse into the need to constantly adapt our creative energies to our continuously evolving students and their needs. No one has all the answers, but since we are all lifelong learners on this journey of enlightenment, I wish all of us perseverance in our quest to instill knowledge and a love of learning in all our productive struggles with our students and ourselves. Keep up the tremendous work. This is William Clark from Group 4. Have a good day.